He falls in that category, to Lois Beckett, reporter at ProPublica. We've been talking about her story, looking at how campaigns are targeting voters online. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
It was a pleasure.
We'll now go to the floor of the House of Representatives, where they're in morning hour. Thank you so much for joining us on Washington Journal Today.
Today on Capitol Hill, there are hundreds of nurses, chaplains, and social workers, the people who deliver hospice care at the bedside, here to promote an honest discussion and careful analysis of how to help individuals and their families grapple with the final chapter of life. It may be the hardest issue in health care, and the fear that it invokes can be a powerful weapon. For most of us, the majority of health care we receive in our lifetime will be administered in those last few months. It's when we need the most doctors and nursing care, medical procedures, and oftentimes in hospitals. But we know from scientific studies that when patients are educated about their treatment options, they make decisions that are not only aligned with their personal preferences, but shared decision-making relieves stress and anxiety. Ironically, sometimes getting less intensive help, like in a hospice, not only improves the quality of life, these patients, many of them, actually live longer. From a public policy perspective, it's perverse that Medicare will pay for almost any medical procedure, yet not reimburse doctors to have a thoughtful conversation to prepare patients and their families for the delicate, complex, and emotionally demanding decisions surrounding the end of life. That's why I sought to direct Medicare in the Affordable Care Act to cover a voluntary discussion with the doctor about living wills, power of attorney, and end-of-life preferences. Helping patients and their families clarify what they want and need should be an element of any rational, comprehensive health care system. Despite our recent history, it's also a rare common denominator in healthcare politics because it's something that most people actually agree on. In fact, the majority of my Republican colleagues supported a similar provision for terminally ill elderly patients that was part of the 2003 prescription drug bill. I had a friend of mine, a Republican cardiovascular surgeon here in the House, who told me he had many end-of-life conversations, but unfortunately they were often too late. He wished he could have spoken to patients and their families when they could properly reflected, not just when the surgery was merely hours away. During the early debates on the Affordable Care Act, I was confident that this was an area where we were making a contribution to improve the quality of health care, but it actually might be something that would bring us together because of the shared agreement. But unfortunately, battle lines were drawn, and you know how the rest of that story went. Death panels, rationing, forced consultation with government-appointed physicians. In war, truth is the first casualty. The same goes for politics. As a country, we have a difficult time talking rationally and thoughtfully about end-of-life issues. That's why it's so important that we have these dedicated people on Capitol Hill today, the nurses, the hospice workers, the social workers, to have this thoughtful conversation from people who do it every day. Their work to help patients and families can help Congress understand that the work is not finished. I urge my colleagues to take a look at the Personalize Your Health Care Act, H.R. 1589. Join me in making sure that the federal government is a better partner in helping families prepare for this difficult chapter. Thank you, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Today, a number of us are rising to commemorate an individual out of the now more than 2,000 who have lost their lives during Operation Enduring Freedom. I would like to submit for the record 11 names of brave service members who were recently killed in Afghanistan. Today, I would like to recognize a man in particular who is not counted in the 2,000. Sergeant Tom Bagasse, a combat veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, took his own life on May 10, 2020 at Camp Lejeune Marine Base in North Carolina. Tom's wounds were mental, but he is no less a casualty of the war in Afghanistan. That Tom is not counted in this 2,000 number speaks to the fact that our country does not fully understand the effect that a generation of war has had on those who fought it. We do not understand the future cost of caring for over 300,000 returning veterans with mental wounds. Tom's death, like those of the 154 active duty service members who took their own lives at a rate of 1 per day this year, was preventable. Tom left behind a wife, Katie, and 2 children. Today, Katie is working towards becoming a mental health counselor so she can support the thousands of veterans coming home today with mental wounds. We should be inspired by her efforts. Mr. Speaker, I want to share with the House a letter that Katie wrote to her husband, Tom, who had died in May. And she wrote this letter August the 23rd of 2011. These are her words. I wonder what life would be like if you didn't die that day. I wonder what we would be doing right now in this very moment instead. I hate playing the what-if game, but I'm playing it anyway right now. I could really use a hug and kiss from you. I love the way you kiss me. I wish your arms were around me right now. Guess wishing is all I can do. Love always, Katie. Mr. Speaker, it's time now that our Congress stands up and says, let's bring our troops home now. Let's start the process. If we brought them home now, it would still take months, maybe even years. But 2014 is the date that the President says we'll start bringing them home. Then there's also going to be a security agreement with Afghanistan. 10 years, spending about $4 billion a month. We need to be spending that money to take care of our wounded, both physically and mentally, veterans. We need to start spending that money here in America and build our streets and roads and bridges. Mr. Speaker, it is time that the Congress do its job based on the Constitution. We have the authority based on the Constitution. I don't know how many, this poster of Sergeant Bagasse and his wife Katie, how many are coming back from Afghanistan and those who came back from Iraq that are mentally wounded? It's time that this Congress start thinking about the wounded and think about the families who lost loved ones in Afghanistan and Iraq. Let's not cheat them out of their benefits because we want to spend money in Afghanistan that we can't even account for by the Inspector General. Mr. Speaker, I will at this time ask God to please bless our men and women in uniform, to please bless the families of our men and women in uniform. I ask God in His loving arms to hold the families who've given a child dying for freedom in Afghanistan and Iraq. I ask God bless the House and Senate that we will do what is right in the eyes of God for God's people today. I ask God bless the President of the United States that he will do what is right in the eyes of God for God's people today and tomorrow. And 3 times I will ask God, please God, please God, please God, continue to bless America, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Corton, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, unless Congress acts in the next 11 days, the interest rates for the subsidized Stafford student loan program is going to increase from 3.4% to 6.8%. This is at a time when student loan debt now has topped the $1 trillion number, according to the Federal Reserve Bank. This is a program which will provide relief for over 7 million college students who literally today are already trying to budget for next fall's semesters at colleges and universities, 2-year colleges, 4-year colleges. And yet, this Congress left for 10 days up until yesterday with another recess, the 9th recess this year. This number, 11 days until the rate hike increases, should probably be 6 days, because that's all the number of days that the Speaker has scheduled between now and July 1st. How do we get to this point? In 2007, when the Democrats controlled the Congress, we voted for the College Cost Reduction Act with Republican support that cut the rate for the subsidized Stafford student loan program from 6.8% to 3.4%. That helped over 15 million college kids over the last 5 years. It was a sunset measure like many other bills that passed in this Congress. And last July 25th, on that podium, President Obama challenged this Congress to avoid allowing that rate to double on July 1st. For 3 solid months, we had absolutely no action in this Congress. No hearings, no markup, no bill. Luckily, external pressure was exercised on this chamber. We had 130,000 college students drop off petition signatures to the Speaker demanding action. And finally, the Speaker rushed a bill to the floor without a hearing, without a markup, a totally hyper-partisan bill that did delay the rate hike for 1 year, and yet was paid for with a measure that was so unacceptable, cutting programs and funding for cervical cancer screening, diabetes screening, cardiac screening. It was a measure which was dead on arrival, but at least it was some response. There was at least a flicker of acknowledgement that there was a real problem out there for middle-class families around the country. Now, on January 5th, when the President announced his challenge to the Congress, I introduced legislation before midnight that night, which would have locked in the lower rate at 3.4%. We have 152 co-sponsors in the House for that measure. And in the Senate, there is a back and forth going on right now about a 1-year extension, which, again, there actually are some hopeful signs. Leader Reid, Harry Reid, introduced a measure with a pay-for, which was not greeted with immediate criticism and denunciation. So there is actually a chance that between now and July 1st, we can come together and do our job and actually be here to work on the people's business to make sure that, again, 7 million college kids don't see their interest rates spike at a time when student loan debt, again, has shattered all records. The stakes could not be higher. U.S. graduation rates now have fallen to 12th in the world. We were number 1 in the 1980s. There are a variety of reasons which explain that, but certainly the high cost of college is one of those reasons. And we are seeing now an alarming trend of individuals who take on debt to go to college and then never get their degrees. Debt without a degree is a almost death sentence in terms of a lifetime of struggling in terms of trying to get ahead. And we as a Congress have a responsibility to make sure that that doesn't happen, or at least that we don't add to the problem by allowing these rate hikes to go into effect on July 1st. Again, Mr. Speaker, if you look historically at the Stafford Student Loan Program, if you look historically at the Pell Grant Program, if you look historically at the Land Grant College Program instituted by President Abraham Lincoln, this is an issue which we have always been able to put aside partisanship and move forward together to make sure that the real crown jewels of our country, which is our people, particularly our young people, is always protected. And that test is now before us over the next 11 days. Let's do the right thing. Let's work together. Let's compromise and come up with a plan to protect 7 million college kids and for once send a signal to the people of this country that we are listening and that we are actually responding to critical needs that face this nation's future. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, for 5 minutes.
Question and consent to address the House for 5 minutes, provided in my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, our nation's income tax system is a giant mess. It's complicated, it's not fair, it's outdated, and it's not everyone follows the law. Hypothetically, suppose tomorrow the President issued an edict from the White House directing the IRS not to enforce tax laws for certain special people. For example, people under the age of 30. Why? Maybe the President just doesn't like the law, so he issues that new order. Well, Mr. Speaker, last Friday, much to the surprise of all of us who believe in the Constitution and the separation of powers, something very similar did happen. In his latest Friday afternoon surprise, the President issued a decree unilaterally discarding the immigration law of the land, a law passed by Congress and signed by a previous President. The President disagrees with the law, and since he had to have his way in spite of the Constitution, he improperly ordered his way to be the law of the land. The President's temporary amnesty plan applies to those who are under 30 years of age.
They also can obtain a work permit. It would be nice if the President was as concerned about the 23 million Americans who are looking for work in America as he is about the 12 million undocumented individuals the President claims are looking for work in America. News reports even show 50% of new college graduates can't even find work. Mr. Speaker, here is a chart we all saw probably in 9th grade civics class. A bill is filed in the House. If the House of Representatives debates it and passes the bill, it goes down the hallway to the Senate. And they discuss and vote on the bill, and if they pass the bill, it becomes the law if the President signs it. We call that the law of the land. But the President, it seems, has ignored most of this and just issued new orders from the White House, not paying any attention to the Senate or to the House of Representatives. Mr. Speaker, like most of us learned in 9th grade civics classes, it's Congress's job to write laws and the President's job to execute the law. That means enforce the law. It doesn't mean he's supposed to ignore law and then issue his own policies, like kings used to do with their policies. He has to follow law whether he likes it or not. Once upon a time, the President even claimed to believe in the Constitution. Here's what he said last year. With respect to the notion that I can just suspend deportations through executive order, that's just not the case, because there are laws on the books that Congress has passed. But that was a year ago. That was then, and this is now. If the President doesn't believe he likes the law, he can ignore it and come up with his own set of rules. Our founders envisioned a country where freedom was protected from government and was limited from the policies of kings. You see, old King George III of England constantly decreed new laws without the consent of the people. That was one of the reasons why we rebelled against the merry old King of England and his monarchy and his policies. Our ancestors structured the American government in the Constitution. And last time I checked, it was Congress who makes law, and it's the job of the executive branch to enforce laws, not ignore the ones he doesn't like. The immigration system needs fixing. Congress should do its job and fix the problem. In the meantime, the President should do his job, not ours, and he should enforce the law. Otherwise, we have lawlessness in America. The President says he can use prosecutorial discretion to not enforce immigration law. Mr. Speaker, the President is wrong again. I dealt with prosecutorial discretion as a former prosecutor and a judge. Prosecutorial discretion is when a prosecutor does not prosecute a specific case because the accused is innocent. There is insufficient evidence, witnesses have disappeared, the government violated the rights of the accused, etc. Prosecutorial discretion cannot be used to ignore a specific law because the government just doesn't like the law. It is true, through no fault of their own, young, undocumented individuals are here as a result of decades of a failed, broken immigration system. But the President has no interest in fixing what is broken. He is more concerned with picking up a few votes to further his re-election. The law gets in the way, so his policies look like they come from an emperor instead of a president. So what new orders will be issued next week from the President and the White House? Is he going to ignore the tax code for some in the name of prosecutorial discretion? I guess it depends on what political forces push the President to new orders and decrees. We shall see. Stay tuned for another day in the life of the Republic. It's time for the former constitutional professor to follow the Constitution, not make up his own rules during his on-the-job training. And that's just the way it is.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I've had the pleasure of chairing the Congressional Children's Caucus for a number of years, founding it almost a decade ago. I'm delighted to have, as part of our agenda, a number of issues dealing with mentoring, nutrition, obesity, issues dealing with now a phenomenon that is raging across our nation, bullying, and introduced legislation just 6 months and now revised legislation that deals with renewing the Juvenile Accountability Block Grant and as well providing for intervention on these issues. I'm looking forward to bipartisan support because, as we've seen statistics across America, children as young as pre-K and kindergarten now can interpret actions as bullying. We need to give help and relief to school districts and parents and families, but most of all, a public statement that that action is intolerable and that we want our children to go to schools and playgrounds and places that will find comfort and enjoyment as a child. That brings me also to my commitment to science, technology, engineering, and math. And I was very pleased to be involved in a program that provided opportunity for 6th and 7th grade boys at risk. It gave them math and science in the morning with what we call the smart board. In the afternoon, they played with college football players and learned the skills of football with various sports leagues. And, of course, we had the corporate support. And so I raised a question of my good friend, the company Halliburton, and asked for their CEO, who was supportive of this program last summer, to recognize the value of science, technology, engineering, and math, and respond to the needs of these inner-city boys in Houston, a place where the company is located, with so many employees. I'm reminded of going to give comfort to many of their employees when KBR was owned by Halliburton, and they had lost employees in Iraq, tragically. It was my task to go and to respond to that crisis and to give my sympathy. That's the way we are as neighbors. But they are not acting neighborly now. And there are a number of boys, same kind of children that I see that come here to Washington all the time. Of course, these at-risk boys have never probably been out of the city of Houston, but they're in school districts across the city. And isn't it a shame that we can't get a response with all the great employees that I know care about the city to be able to support these children? So I asked for the CEO to respond to these at-risk boys. I'll certainly be looking forward to engaging and making sure that that happens. It's very important. And I understand that there has been some question about an executive order that deals with helping children, again, across this nation, children who have come to the United States not of their own accord, brought by their parents, who've been here since the age of 16, who have attempted, like many children that I see, to do the right thing, to get a high school diploma, to be in the United States service, to get a GED. They happen to have come and they're unstatused. And this issue has been before the Congress for 11 years. In fact, there was an effort passed by the House, moved to the Senate as was instructed, and the Senate refused to move forward on something called the DREAM Act. If you look at all of our cases and our caseload in our respective districts, particularly those of us in the Southwest, tons of cases that have come in that will bring tears to your eyes, children being deported away from their families or families being separated. So let me disabuse you of the notion that this is not done under the law. There's a regulatory scheme under the Homeland Security Department that allows discretionary determination about deportation or whether or not someone should go into deportation. These are children. The President did the right thing by having an executive order that utilized the powers by the Secretary of Homeland Security under the Code of Federal Regulation to be able to use that discretion. It's the right thing to do. But Congress, it's not too late, my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, to come forward and support the DREAM Act that has been introduced over and over again that had bipartisan support. In fact, it's not too late to help the farmers, to help the high-tech industry, and pass comprehensive immigration reform. Who are we other than Americans who are humanitarians, who are empathetic, who love the values of this nation and believe in opportunity? I don't want people to be equating the loss of jobs with allowing a few children to be able to be saved from deportation when they have going to a nation, whether they come from South and Central America, they come from Ireland, they come from Italy, they come from the continent of Africa, the Caribbean. It is time to be the nation that we know we are, which is lifting up people, giving opportunity, and this is the greatest country in the world. And I look forward to corporations responding to at-risk boys, Mr. Speaker, and as well that we recognize the importance of helping children wherever they are. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Brooks, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, last week the White House decreed partial amnesty for an estimated 3 million illegal aliens and mandated acceptance of illegal alien work permit applications. The White House decree is bad for America. First, Mr. Speaker, it is unconscionable for the White House to pit unemployed Americans against illegal aliens in a competition for scarce jobs. In 2009, the Pew Hispanic Center found that 7.8 million struggling American families have already lost job opportunities to illegal aliens. America suffers an 8.2% unemployment rate. Even worse, Hispanic Americans suffer an 11% unemployment rate. Even worse, African Americans suffer a 14% unemployment rate. Even worse, American teenagers suffer a 25% unemployment rate. All are hammered by a White House decree that grants as many as 3 million illegal aliens work permits. I understand heartfelt compassion for illegal aliens, but where is the compassion for millions of Americans who are unemployed and suffering from jobs lost to illegal aliens? Where is the compassion for American taxpayers who must pay higher taxes to support millions of extra unemployed? Second, the White House decree grants amnesty to illegal aliens. Webster's defines amnesty as, quote, the act of an authority as a government by which pardon is granted to a large group of individuals. Further, pardon is defined as, quote, a release from the legal penalties of an offense. A penalty for breaking America's immigration laws is not lawfully getting a job. The White House releases illegal aliens from this penalty. Hence, the White House grants amnesty. While the amnesty is admittedly partial, it is amnesty nonetheless. Third, Mr. Speaker, the 1980s amnesty taught foreigners that America won't enforce its immigration laws. The result is over 10 million illegal aliens in America and an immigration mess that is destructive to America. A 2011 Federation of Americans for Immigration Reform study found that illegal aliens cost American taxpayers a net loss of $99 billion a year. Illegal aliens overcrowd our schools and need costly English interpreters. In 2011, illegal aliens drove up America's K-12 education costs by $49 billion per year. Illegal aliens overcrowd our emergency rooms, delay treatment for Americans, and drive up health care costs. Illegal aliens commit crimes, sometimes heinous, against American citizens and burden taxpayers with higher jail costs. In my home county, more Madison Countyans have been killed by illegal aliens than have lost their lives in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. Mr. Speaker, amnesty did not solve America's illegal alien problem in the 1980s, nor will it today. Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Mr. Speaker, America must never again give blanket amnesty to illegal aliens. Fourth, Mr. Speaker, the White House decree is of questionable constitutionality. The Constitution states, and I quote Article 1, Section 1, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States, and, quote, the Congress shall have the power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. The Congress does not empower a president to make law. Hence, the only change to immigration law is as our Constitution demands, through Congress, not by imperial decree. Mr. Speaker, in 2011, when it was not an election year, President Obama agreed. On March 28, 2011, the President stated, and I quote verbatim, with respect to the notion that I can just suspend deportations through executive order, that's just not the case, because there are laws in the books that Congress has passed. The executive branch's job is to enforce and implement those laws. For me to simply through executive order ignore those congressional mandates would not conform with my appropriate role as President. Last September, the President again stated, quote, I just have to continue to say this notion that somehow I can just change the laws unilaterally is just not true. The fact of the matter is there are laws in the books that I have to enforce, and I think there's been a great disservice done to the cause of the DREAM Act that somehow, by myself, I can go and do these things. It's just not true. Mr. Speaker, the President's own words speak volumes about the constitutionality of a White House decree that undermines America and the rule of law. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman for Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, this Congress's failure to extend renewable energy tax credits is already costing my home state, the Commonwealth of Virginia, jobs. A CBS News reported last month, Virginia is losing a wind turbine development to Spain because the United States doesn't have the right policies and tax incentives in place for renewable energy development. A spokesperson for the wind energy company, Gamesa, said that the uncertainty over the future of those tax credits for wind energy and the lack of federal energy policy caused the company to invest in Spain instead of Virginia. The jobs to construct and maintain that turbine will be Spanish, not American. The so-called Strategic Energy Production Act, coming to the House floor this week, actually perpetuates the problem by doubling down on oil and gas to the detriment of developing new and renewable energy sources in America. Even the Republican governor of Virginia said that the lack of national energy policy was one of the reasons we aren't moving forward with this project in America. President Obama has called on Congress to pass a clean energy standard that would guarantee a market for wind, solar, and other clean domestic energy sources. That legislation has not received any consideration in this House. The House Republican leadership won't even bring legislation to the floor to extend critical renewable tax credits for wind and solar energy. Republicans consider it anathema to even suggest that they reconsider special oil and gas company tax breaks in the face of record industry profits. Yet while the extension of renewable energy tax credits would encourage the development of an innovative industry that would support America's energy independence, they allow it to wither. In fact, House Republicans actually attacked the renewable energy sector through a number of different amendments to the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill earlier this month. As part of the Recovery Act, Congress and the President extended production and investment tax credits for the production of wind and solar energy. As a result of those investments, wind energy electricity generation has grown by 40,000 megawatts in the last 2 years. Between 2007 and 2010, wind energy represented 35% of all new electricity generation in America. Solar energy production in America more than doubled in that time period. Approximately 173,000 Americans work now in the wind and solar industries, with 70% growth in the number of wind energy jobs since 2007. What other industry can we point to that has seen that kind of significant job growth? In fact, the growth in renewable energy jobs has helped offset job losses in the coal industry, which has been declining for many years. As the nation continues to recover and as monthly job growth moderates, it is essential to support innovative American industries such as wind and solar with extensive growth potential. Wind and solar electricity generation creates American jobs throughout the supply chain. For example, Micron, the last computer chip manufacturer in America, is a semiconductor manufacturer in my district. Its components are used in solar installations. The value of solar installations completed in 2011 was $8.4 billion. Thanks to Buy America provisions and other domestic manufacturing programs in the Recovery Act, we're increasing the share of wind energy components manufactured in America. Over 470 factories in the United States now build components for wind turbines. But as tax incentives expire, where will that future growth go? In the global hunt for scarce resources, the renewable energy industry will not just be a job creator, though it will create jobs. It will also help support national security. If America is not at the forefront of this burgeoning field, then we will be left behind as global competitors seize that initiative. Unfortunately, all this economic growth is at risk as the Republican House leadership ignores renewable energy tax extensions. Failure to extend the production and investment tax credits for renewable energy will mean losing projects across the country. As our loss of wind facility in Virginia demonstrates, Mr. Speaker, the failure to extend these tax credits in a timely manner already is hurting what would otherwise continue to be a growth industry. And I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I enjoyed listening to my Republican colleagues talk about the Constitution and how a bill becomes a law. I taught freshman civics, and a bill passes both chambers. The bill then goes to the President. The President then signs the bill. It becomes a law. The job of the Chief Executive is to enforce the law as signed and as passed. Like the 1982 Nuclear Waste Policy Act, it is the law of the land. The amendments passed in 1987 identified Yucca Mountain as the sole geological repository for nuclear waste in this country. The problem is it's not being enforced by the President, who's complicit with the majority leader in the Senate, Senator Reid, in stopping the project. So over the past year, I've been coming down to the floor and identifying where we at on the status of what do we do with high-level nuclear waste. And I've gone through the whole country. I have identified all the senators and where they stand. We actually have a majority of senators, 55 of them, who support high-level nuclear waste and Yucca Mountain being stored there. We have 23 that either have made statements of no, or 22 that we don't know their position. Can you imagine being a U.S. Senator on a very important position, never having to state your position on what to do with high-level nuclear waste or defense waste, especially if it's in your own state, and never being forced to come to a position? So over the past year, we've been going around the country identifying all these locations, and now the time for truth has come to really start narrowing down on individual states and senators who should at least state their position. So I returned to my the next-door neighbor state, the state of Missouri. I live in the St. Louis metropolitan area. I represent parts of 30 counties in southern Illinois, but I'm very close to the state of Missouri. In fact, I root for the Cardinals, the Rams, the Blues, and if the University of Missouri is not playing the Fighting Illini, I'll root for the Missouri Tigers. So Missouri has a nuclear power plant called Callaway, and what I did months ago, I came down on the floor, these are old posters, and compared Callaway to Yucca Mountain. Right now, Callaway has 650 metric tons uranium of spent fuel on site. Yucca has none. Waste will be stored 1,000 feet underground. Waste is being stored in pools above ground. Waste would be 1,000 feet from the water table. At Callaway, it's 65 feet above the groundwater. At Yucca, the waste would be 100 miles from the Colorado River. At Callaway, it's only 5 miles from the Missouri River. So the state of Missouri needs an answer by their elected members of what should they do, how should we handle the nuclear waste at Callaway. Well, Senator Blunt has already stated his position that he supports moving nuclear waste to Yucca Mountain. In fact, in a floor vote just 2 weeks ago, 8 of the 9 members of Congress, a bipartisan majority, said nuclear waste should be in Yucca Mountain, or at least we should finish the scientific study to see if it's feasible versus keeping it in Missouri. The members of the House who voted in support of the Shimkus Amendment was Representative Aiken, Representative Clay, Representative Cleaver, Representative Emerson, Representative Graves, Representative Hartzler, Representative Long, Representative Lukemire. Of course, we know Senator Blunt supports it. Now we focus on Senator McCaskill. This is no surprise to her. I've talked to her personally about this, that there would be a time when eventually she needs to state, does she support high-level nuclear waste being stored in Missouri? Does she support a long-term geological storage underneath a mountain in a desert in Nevada? If she would make a statement, we could then move her from the undecideds to either a nay or a yay. And if a yay, that would bring us to 56. We're actually trying to see if we can get 60 United States senators to say, yeah, we support moving forward. We've only spent $15 billion. Start going back to 1982 to prepare, locate the site. Yucca Mountain is just not a mountain on its own, but it's at the nuclear test site. It's bigger than the state of Rhode Island, the federal ground. It's federal property. And so we come down on the floor. We'll be doing this in the following weeks, highlighting individual senators who are either undecided, no commitment, no position on what high-level nuclear waste in their state, what should be the disposition of it, where it should go, and at least get them on the record as far as this issue. Again, this law was passed in 1982. The amendment passed identifying Yucca Mountain as the long-term geological repository was then signed in 1987. We would just ask the administration to follow the law. I yield back my time.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Woolsey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, while the House was out of session last week, the nation suffered its 2,000th fatality in the conflict known as Operation Enduring Freedom. The overwhelming number of those deaths coming in Afghanistan. For more than 10 years now, we've been losing young, courageous service members on a mission that isn't bolstering our national security, isn't supported by the American people, but is costing us billions of dollars every month. What a disaster and what a tragedy. Mr. Speaker, from this chamber, I regularly hear members of the majority invoking mortality in support of our morality, in support of efforts to cut effective programs that help the most vulnerable members of our society. So where is their moral outrage and where is their budget axe when it comes to the most expensive government program imaginable that has killed 2,000 of our troops? 2 of those 2,000 come from my part of the country, from the 6th Congressional District of California. Army Specialist Christopher Gathercole and Army Sergeant Ryan Connolly, both of Santa Rosa, California, were killed less than a month apart in the year 2008. And we had others who were killed during the nearly 9 years that our troops were in Iraq. But 2,000 deaths doesn't even begin to tell the story of the human cost of this war. More than 15,000 Americans have come home wounded, many in ways that will alter their lives forever. Even those who returned with their bodies intact often suffer from devastating post-traumatic stress that may never go away. Post-development suicide has reached epidemic levels. Nearly 2.5 million men and women have served in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I actually can't say that I trust the veterans' health care system is prepared or will be prepared to deal with the huge demand that will be placed on its services in the coming years. A recent report prepared by VA doctors outlines the unique and varied health care needs of returning Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. In addition to traumatic brain injuries, depression, and substance abuse, there's chronic muscle pain, sleep disturbances, hypertension, and complications from environmental exposures. Many of our returning heroes have difficulty readjusting to civilian life, integrating once again into their families, their workplaces, and their communities. We had better be willing, as a nation, to write that check for their care as we were as willing to write that check that damaged them in the first place. And it's critical, Mr. Speaker, that we remember the human cost is not just here in the United States. 2,000 Americans have died in nearly 11 years of war. Well, 3,000 Afghan civilians, many of them children, were killed last year alone for the cause of their so-called liberation. It's not enough to acknowledge the casualties of this war, to memorialize the dead and pay tribute to their service. What we need is an immediate change of policy. To extend the war through 2014 is to sentence hundreds more service members to their deaths, all for a policy that isn't achieving its stated objectives, while strengthening the very terrorists and extremists that we're trying to defeat. There's only one solution, Mr. Speaker. There's only one choice that will finally keep the death toll from climbing. That choice is bring our troops home. Bring them home now. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Paul, for 5 minutes.
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Plans, rumors, and war propaganda for attacking Syria and disposing Assad has been around for many months. This past week, however, it was reported that the Pentagon indeed was finalizing plans to do just that. In my opinion, all the evidence to justify this attack is bogus. It is no more credible than the pretext given for the 2003 invasion of Iraq or for the 2011 attack on Libya. The total waste of those wars should cause us to pause before this all-out effort at occupation and regime change is initiated against Syria. There are no national security concerns that require such a foolish escalation of violence in the Middle East. There should be no doubt that our security interests are best served by completely staying out of the internal strife now raging in Syria. We are already too much involved in supporting the forces within Syria, anxious to overthrow their current government. Without outside interference, the strife, now characterized as a civil war, would likely be non-existent. Whether or not we attack yet another country occupying it and setting up a new regime that we hope we can control poses a serious constitutional question. From where does a president get such authority? Since World War II, the proper authority to go to war has been ignored. It has been replaced by international entities like the United Nations and NATO or the President himself, while ignoring the Congress. And sadly, the people don't object. Our recent presidents explicitly maintain that the authority to go to war is not the U.S. Congress. This has been the case since the 1950s, when we were first taken into war in Korea under a UN resolution and without congressional approval. And once again, we are about to engage in military action against Syria and at the same time irresponsibly reactivating the Cold War with Russia. We're now engaged in a game of chicken with Russia, which presents a much greater threat to our security than does Syria. Would we tolerate Russia in Mexico demanding a humanitarian solution to the violence on the U.S.-Mexican border? We would consider that a legitimate concern for us. But for us to be engaged in Syria, where the Russians have a legal naval base, is equivalent to the Russians being in our backyard in Mexico. We are hypocritical when we condemn Russia for protecting its neighborhood interests as we claim we are doing the same ourselves thousands of miles from our shore. There's no benefit for us to be picking sides, secretly providing assistance and encouraging civil strife in an effort to effect regime change in Syria. Falsely charging the Russians with supplying military helicopters to Assad is an unnecessary provocation. Falsely blaming the Assad government for a so-called massacre perpetrated by a violent warring faction, rebel faction, is nothing more than war propaganda. Most knowledgeable people now recognize that the planned war against Syria is merely the next step to take on the Iranian government, something the neocons openly admit. Controlling Iranian oil, just as we have done in Saudi Arabia and we are attempting to do in Iraq, is the real goal of the neoconservatives who have been in charge of our foreign policy for the past couple of decades. War is inevitable without a significant change in our foreign policy, and soon. Disagreements between our two political parties are minor. Both agree the sequestration of any war funds must be canceled. Neither side wants to abandon our aggressive and growing presence in the Middle East and South Asia. This crisis building can easily get out of control and become a much bigger war than just another routine occupation and regime change that the American people have grown to accept or ignore. It's time the United States tried a policy of diplomacy, seeking peace, trade, and friendship. We must abandon our military effort to promote and secure an American empire. Besides, we're broke. We can't afford it, and worst of all, we're fulfilling the strategy laid out by Osama bin Laden, whose goal had always been to bog us down in the Middle East and bring on our bankruptcy here at home.
It's time to bring our troops home and establish a non-interventionist foreign policy, which is the only road to peace and prosperity. This week, I am introducing legislation to prohibit the administration, absent a declaration of war by Congress, from supporting directly or indirectly any military or paramilitary operations in Syria. I hope my colleagues will join me in this effort. I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last Thursday, 2,000th U.S. military service member was killed in Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. I send my deepest sympathies to the families and the loved ones of each individual who has been killed since this war began more than a decade ago. Those losses are a cause for sadness beyond what I can adequately convey in my words. Having just celebrated Father's Day with my daughters and son, I reflect on the fact that each fallen soldier was a child of some parent. Many were husbands and wives, and many were parents themselves. We are a nation at war, yet the burden of this war has been primarily borne by a very few, by our military service members and their families. Less than 1% of the United States population is in the armed services. Many Americans were not aware of last week's tragic milestone, and perhaps they may have glanced at the fatality count in their local paper, and they went about their continuing daily events. This is a war that, for many, goes on in the background, while most Americans carry on their daily lives. It's imperative that we stop and think deeply about the human cost of this war. We must read the names of those who have been killed. Look at their pictures. Imagine the grief of those who have been left behind. We must also think about those who have been wounded. Every day outside this chamber we see yet one more military woman or man who have lost a limb, who have been harmed. They're in our military hospitals now. Their future is uncertain. We must think about those service members whose lives have been so shattered by the experience of war that they cannot continue living. More service members took their lives in this year than were killed in combat in Afghanistan. Only when we feel those losses can we fully comprehend the cost of this war. Recently, this House passed its version of the National Defense Authorization Act that I opposed, but the majority pushed forward a bill that has no meaningful timeline for ending combat operations and bringing our troops home. No concrete plans for transitioning full responsibility for Afghanistan's security to Afghan forces. The supporters of the National Defense Authorization Act had no way to slow down the withdrawal of our troops. They would have American troops continue to fight against a domestic insurgency in Afghanistan, and they would have American troops fighting for the corrupt Karzai government. As members of Congress, we're responsible. We're responsible for authorizing the funds that sustain this war. If we believe this war should continue, we should say that this war is absolutely essential to our nation's security. This war is not. Can we look into the eyes of the mother or father of a serviceman that has been killed and say, your child died for a mission that's absolutely essential to our nation's security? I can't do that, and I believe most of us cannot. I believe it's time for the war in Afghanistan to come to an end. For our troops and our family, they've given enough. We should welcome them home as heroes, and we should ensure that they receive the support and care that is due when they return. We sent our brave servicemen and women to Afghanistan to eliminate international terrorist organizations that threaten the United States. As President Obama said last month, our goal is to destroy al-Qaeda. Our troops have successfully executed this mission with phenomenal dedication and capacity. We have virtually eliminated al-Qaeda from Afghanistan. No expert says that there's more than 100 there, and they have no basis, and they have no operation of any meaningful way. They have demonstrated that we can take terrorists out wherever they are in this world. We have captured or killed most all of al-Qaeda's top commanders. 1 year ago, we celebrated the historic moment when Osama bin Laden, the 9/11 mastermind, was killed. He met his just end. The cost of this war in blood and treasure has been staggering. Even those who have not given their lives have given of their lives. It's time for this war to end. The loyalty and dedication of our service members, our most sacred resource, must be conserved, and we must not squander it. End this war now. I yield back my time.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, for 5 minutes.
Request permission to address the House on revising extent.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor and commemorate the 60th anniversary of Levittown, Pennsylvania, which is the place that I have called home my entire life. Located in historic Bucks County, Pennsylvania, construction of Levittown began in 1952 and was completed in 1958. One of the first planned communities built in the United States, it became a popular first home for thousands of returning veterans from World War II and Korea. Over the course of its rich history, Levittown has developed into a model middle-class community. Now it is home to over 50,000 residents with schools, churches, and businesses that help create a sense of community and foster a warm environment for families to live and to work, to raise their families and to retire to. Levittown's residents have worked in our steel mills, built our communities, and served in our military, all while raising their children and their grandchildren. It was a pleasure growing up in such a close-knit, hard-working community. I'm proud to say that I'm from Levittown, raising my own family there. The highest honor of all is being given the chance to serve Levittown in the United States Congress. I will continue to listen to and work with members of my community to ensure that all of their voices are heard. Congratulations to all who have called Levittown home over the last 60 years. With such a rich history, Levittown deserves our recognition and praise. I'm honored to live amongst these great families and wish them all the best on this momentous occasion. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Fox, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to wish a well-deserved, happy 100th birthday to a pillar of Watauga County, Mr. Robert Gray Shipley, Sr. Mr. Shipley was born in Valley Cruces, North Carolina on June 23, 1912. Growing up on his parents' farm, Mr. Shipley's aptitude for agriculture and ranching was evident from a young age. He put that skill to use, working his way through college, milking cows, judging livestock competitions, and maintaining records in Virginia Polytechnic Institute's dairy department. Mr. Shipley began teaching upon his graduation from Virginia Tech in 1933, and aside from the time he spent in the United States Air Force as a gunnery instructor on B-24 bombers, teaching agriculture in an innovative and hands-on manner is what he did for most of his professional life. In fact, Mr. Shipley counts among his many students my husband, Tom. Today, if you take a trip down to Watauga County, evidence of Mr. Shipley's involvement in the community is everywhere. He helped organize the Watauga County Hereford Association. He taught sheep shearing at 4-H clubs. He ran the Cove Creek Horse Show for 2 decades. He's a member of the North Carolina State Fair Hall of Fame, the Western North Carolina Agriculture Hall of Fame, and the North Carolina Livestock Hall of Fame. He's a charter member of the Boone Rotary Club and is a mainstay in the Cove Creek Ruritan Club, working faithfully at every monthly fish fry. Throughout his busy life, Mr. Shipley has had a wonderful partner, his wife of nearly 70 years, Agnes. Together, they are the proud parents of 3 children, grandparents to 6, and great-grandparents to 9. This weekend, friends and former students of the Shipleys will be gathering at the historic Cove Creek High School in Sugar Grove to celebrate Mr. Shipley's 100th birthday and Mrs. Shipley's 95th birthday. I speak for the community when I express gratitude for the lives of the Shipleys and for their being the wonderful role models that they are. I yield back.
Pursuant to Clause 12A, print A, of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess to the hour of 12 noon today.
The House gaveling out now. Members will be back